well, we're finally here at the most controversial Star Wars movie, and probably the most controversial part of the video. Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi is a pretty good movie. Wait, please let me land. In terms of cinematography, dialogue, and the themes that this movie presents, it's actually pretty good. However, the issue with this film is that it effectively left the Star Wars franchise in limbo due to the decisions that were made plot-wise, which ultimately made it hard to create a satisfying follow-up. Now with this movie, I'm going to go through it chronologically as most of the characters have already been introduced, and the plot is the main focal point from here on out. The movie starts out with a massive space battle between the Resistance and the First Order, with Poe Dameron taking the lead in battle. Tension arises when Poe ignores Leia's orders to retreat as he believed that he could destroy a whole dreadnought before they escaped. Poe's squadron managed to achieve this, but with heavy casualties, which essentially sparks his story arc, which essentially is him being a narrow-minded leader. I'll be honest, this plotline is very contrived, as you'll soon see when I introduce a certain other character. However, I do like Poe's flaws with him being hot-headed but effective. The Resistance jumps into hyperspace, but shortly finds out that they're being tracked through hyperspace using a new tracking technology. Now, this technology is something that should have never been introduced because it means that escape is not an option anymore within space battles. Unless there's some sort of limitation or heavy resource cost to this technology, this limits the outcomes of any space battles that follow from The Last Jedi. I'm gonna move on from this because there's a lot more to cover, but there's more ideas like this that were introduced which are world breaking and potentially could limit writers in the future. It's then stated that the fleet that they are part of is the entire Resistance, which deadass makes me want to know, what was Luke and Leia doing for all of these years? So apparently, we should have known this because apparently the First Order wiped the New Republic out using Starkiller based in the first movie. Why was this never clearly explained? I've got multiple questions such as, how was the New Republic decimated in one attack? Wouldn't Luke and Leia's allies come to defend the galaxy again to make sure the Empire 2.0 doesn't rise up? How did the First Order get so powerful so quickly? Don't even get me started on Luke's Jedi, which we'll get into in a sec. After this revelation that we missed, the First Order attacks the Resistance fleet with Kylo Ren taking the reins in his personal starfighter. He gets a clean shot at the bridge of the Resistance capital ship, but declines to take the shot as he senses Leia on the bridge, which again shows his conflict between the light and dark side as he still holds love for Leia. The bridge gets blown up anyways, with Leia getting dragged into the cold embrace of deep space, and while her organs freeze over, she somehow Mary Poppins her way back onto the capital ship. Yeah, I'm actually going to give a pass for this scene because she's meant to be strong in the Force and Star Wars always has a level of goofiness, so I'll allow it. She ends up unconscious for a long while, and with all of the Resistance leaders dead, including Admiral Akbar, RIP, Vice Admiral Holdo is assigned as the acting leader of the Resistance, and I'll be so honest, she retroactively causes more problems that could have been solved earlier. Now narratively, this character is meant to be unlikable compared to Poe, until her noble sacrifice later on, which is why I feel like she's seen as controversial in some circles. But to me, she's just a plot device. She's used to create tension between her and Poe, which results in Finn, who woke up from his lightsaber nap, and his new fling Rose to get sent on a casino side quest. Finn and Rose first meet near the escape pods as he and a few other Resistance members attempted to escape the capital ship. In Finn's case, he wanted to find Rey because he's had a crush on her since the last movie, but the other Resistance members were deserting, which does amplify the hopelessness of the situation that the Resistance was in. After tasing Finn, they discuss the issue of the hyperspace tracking, which leads to them coming up with a plan to disable the tracker with the help of one of Maz Kanata's contacts, who they need to meet up with on Canto Bight. Meanwhile, we pick up directly with Rey from the last movie as she gives over the Skywalker lightsaber to Luke. He looks at it for a bit and then chucks it away without even saying a word. We end up finding out that after Ben destroyed Luke's Jedi temple, he travelled to the site of the first Jedi temple to essentially become a hermit and die alongside the Jedi teachings. The map that everyone was searching for in the last movie was never meant to be found, which then begs the question of why Luke didn't just destroy the second piece of the map. So I guess we're now at the section where I discuss the portrayal of Luke Skywalker, which I already know is going to get heated again. The idea of deconstructing Luke Skywalker and subverting expectations isn't actually a bad idea. In fact, I think that the way this is portrayed in the first half of the movie is quite good, as our hero from the original trilogy clearly still needed some character growth, which contrasts our initial expectations of him being Space Jesus. Luke is human like the rest of us, and even his failures are going to affect him on a deep level. There's also signs of introspection as he's done his research on the Galactic Republic Jedi. Both his order and theirs has led to death and destruction with the rise of the Empire and the First Order, which does make ending the Jedi a logical conclusion that you could pick up from that. Training Rey would mean that he would be continuing this cycle, which will only keep going until someone burns it down. However, is it likely that Luke from the original trilogy would just disappear and let the First Order rise? Probably not. In fact, I think that Luke in this movie is completely different to how he was in the original trilogy. Many people share this same sentiment, as it's hard to believe that the character who brought Darth Vader back to the light would give up on the world around him, disconnect himself from the Force, and abandon his own nephew to the dark side. Again, people can change and develop in different ways, but with what we knew about Luke, it's highly unlikely that he would have ended up how he did in The Last Jedi. To briefly go over the events on Luke's island, Rey follows Luke around to eventually convince him to train her in the Force and help the Resistance. They have a brief mention of Han's death due to Chewie and the Falcon being present without him, and it's implied that Rey and Chewie explained what happened off screen. A little later, Luke shows the original Jedi texts and questions why Rey is even there on the island. During this scene, she says something that was always there awoke inside her, and she now needs someone to help her make sense of it. This implies that the Force awoke within Rey rather than Finn, which was implied in The Force Awakens, which is probably why Finn doesn't show any signs of Force sensitivity in this film. This will make sense later on, as the nature of the light side and dark side of the Force is changed in the film from the worse, but we'll get into that in a bit. Luke vehemently declines to train Rey until he enters the Falcon and speaks to R2, who plays the original recording of Leia asking for Obi-Wan's help. The day after, Luke agrees to teach Rey the ways of the Force, and Rey and Kylo discover a connection between them which allows them to see each other, talk to each other, and even touch each other. No diddy. This confuses both of them, as Rey believes that Kylo is controlling this power and vice versa, but Kylo concludes that this power would overexert Rey, which is foreshadowing that I don't think many people caught even while rewatching this movie. The first lesson helps Rey to fully reach out to the Force, which I quite liked as it gave Knights of the Old Republic 2 vibes, but it's cut short when Rey continues to listen to the I'm assuming dark side nexus of some sort. Luke proceeds to cut the lesson as he starts to see the parallels between her and Kylo Ren due to her power and her decision to listen to the dark side. But it's also revealed that Luke has cut himself off from the Force as Rey couldn't sense him. I dislike this for the pure fact that it makes Luke unlikable, and it reinforces the idea that he wasn't willing to take accountability. By cutting himself off, he can't sense anyone or commune with the Force ghosts, which would have been very helpful. Secondly, this concept of cutting yourself off from the Force completely changes how the Force works, and the Star Wars galaxy again. Sorry, I'm not trying to nerd out here, but seeing as we were already talking about KOTOR 2 earlier, one of the most important concepts in that game was the traumatic and deadly consequences of severing yourself from the Force. This makes sense as the Force binds all life in the galaxy together, and it's described to be literally everywhere. You can't just opt out of the Force, literally all life forms are meant to be bound to it, and Force sensitives are just those that can manipulate it due to their stronger connectivity to serve their needs. I feel like Rian Johnson had this idea that before this film, only Jedi and Sith were able to use the Force, but in having this idea, he neglected to fully understand how it works and why most Force abilities we've seen in the series have been from Jedi and Sith. Moving on from that, Luke explains the failures of the Jedi, which is valid, but then proceeds to throw Obi-Wan under the bus for training Vader when he was a Jedi. What? Again, the idea of openly deconstructing the Jedi is fine, but to get to this conclusion and using Obi-Wan as an example is crazy. He also explains that he only decided to start a Jedi temple once he saw Ben's potential. Okay, how do I put this? This is a horrendous writing decision that was made for this version of Luke. Luke at the end of Return of the Jedi was around his early 20s. By the events of The Last Jedi, he looks like he's in his 50s or 60s. Let me state this once more. What was he doing for the past 40 years? Honestly, the galaxy at this point deserves to wither in darkness, and I'll get more in depth with that later, but Luke of all people by the end of Return of the Jedi should have known that the galaxy needs their peacekeepers back. Why would he wait for Leia to have a kid, let him grow into his teens to early 20s, and then decide to train him and a couple of students as Jedi? Even by the end of Return of the Jedi, we could assume without using external material that there'd still be remnants of the Empire that needed to be dealt with. At some point, wouldn't he have came to the conclusion to train more people who were willing into Jedi? And the only reason why I'm still on this is because the movie literally paints Luke and later Rey as the last of the Jedi, meaning he clearly hasn't trained anyone else other than Kylo's class. The only way this would make a lick of sense is if Luke had been isolated on this island for multiple years, but the movies treat it as if he disappeared no more than a month ago. Anyways, after that he proceeds to lie about his assassination attempt on young Ben, which Rey initially believes, but through another Force call, Kylo tells her the truth about what happened that night. One praise I will give to Rey's character is that her constant seeking of parental guidance is a major theme in both films, which we've seen through Han, Leia, and now Luke. It's a funny contrast as Kylo hated Han as he believed he gave him away to Luke, who attempted to murder him, whereas Rey loved him and genuinely saw him like a father figure. This interpretation does change for Kylo throughout the movies due to the lack in consistency for narrative direction, but in this movie he clearly hates Han. Funnily enough though, both Rey and Kylo have reasons now to hate Luke, which I think is an interesting decision, but it's in bad taste for reasons again I'll get into later. This causes Rey to seek out the dark side Nexus thing for answers on her parentage, but she gets none. Rey and Kylo hold hands, but she forgot to lock the door, so Luke barges in, which leads to a confrontation between him and Rey. Rey gives the Luke Skywalker cosplayer what he deserves by igniting his lightsaber against him, which finally causes him to open himself up to the Force, which again I really don't like. He framed the assassination attempt as a moment of weakness as he believed he could stop the destruction of everything he loved, but this is so backwards for Luke's character. Vader was on a kill streak fueled by a whole bunch of kids, but he's scared that his grandson, who isn't even a trained Jedi yet, has darkness in his heart. Again, interesting narrative decision, but this is the completely wrong character to do this for. I could even understand if Ben was a fully trained Jedi Knight that rivaled himself and Anakin at their prime power, but the movie suggests that the mighty, all-powerful Luke Skywalker tried to kill a teenager. I guess the youngling slaying runs in the family. Rey then asks Luke one more time to come with her, but he declines in shame, so Rey leaves to seek out Ben. Luke then proceeds to attempt to burn the temple and the ancient Jedi texts, but on his way Yoda's Force Ghost appears to him. He hesitates to burn it all down, but Yoda makes the decision for him by summoning lightning from the clouds and has it strike the temple. Yeah, I wonder why Force Ghosts don't just help the rebels out then. Also, Yoda in this movie is a puppet. If I remember, there was an obsession with practical effects when the sequel trilogy was coming out, which was perceived as better, but honestly, I've never had a problem with using CGI if it doesn't look horrible and it enables more stunts in these movies. I guess for this instance I'm indifferent to the puppet, but perhaps more could have been done if it was CGI. Luke and Yoda both agreed the Jedi should end, and Luke proceeds to point out all of his failures. Yoda then explains to Luke that they must not lose Rey, and that he needs to pass on the knowledge of his strengths, mastery, weaknesses, and failures, as failure is the greatest teacher of all. I actually like this lesson a lot. It shows development in Yoda, who even as an old Jedi Master, he's come a long way and understands the importance in presenting failure to his students. Luke in this film clearly feels as if he's justified in his actions, but he's just running away from his failures. However, the major missed opportunity with this scene was the fact that Obi-Wan, Anakin, or even Qui-Gon did not appear alongside Yoda. Each of them could have given Luke a valuable lesson, which would have also shown the consequences of him cutting himself off from the Force. These scenes would have also been very powerful as Luke hasn't properly interacted with Anakin on screen, which could have been a father-son bonding moment which Anakin and Luke clearly wanted by the end of Return of the Jedi, and it would have been a reunion for these long-time fan favourites. Meanwhile, while all of this was going down, Finn and Rose were completing their side mission on Canto Bight, which honestly I'm not going to go too in depth on. I like the world building they did by painting the city that they were on as a place for wealthy war profiteers to spend time on, which is something that isn't heavily explored, but overall the mission wasn't even important. Maybe if I do a separate video hyper-analysing the whole of The Last Jedi, I'll go more into it, but essentially they were dragged onto this mission due to misinformation from their chain of command. Admiral Holdo's entire plan to escape the First Order was to load up transport ships and escape on those while playing bait in the capital ship. This is because the First Order can't track smaller transport ships, so they'll be able to sneakily escape onto the planet Crait, where there's an old rebel base they can station on. So can someone explain to me, why doesn't she tell anyone this plan? Poe even begs her to let the crew know if they have a plan, but instead she goes on about hope and remains silent. I could understand if she believed there was a spy on board, but that's never indicated. If she just told the crew earlier about this plan, Finn and Rose would have never gone on their side mission, which means the First Order would have never figured out their escape plan. Just to quickly stay on track, Finn and Rose end up on the ship, but they get betrayed by their codebreaker who sells out their intel to the First Order. So, they end up in a predicament where their top soldiers led by Poe mutiny against her because rightfully so, they believe that they're going to die by abandoning ship and immediately being fired upon by the First Order. This is only broken up by Leia, who wakes up from a space coma and proceeds to knock out Poe and regain control. Jumping back to Rey, she gets brought before Snoke by Kylo Ren in a scene reminiscent of Return of the Jedi. Snoke casually implies that Rey is as strong as Kylo, which I'll talk about in a bit, and proceeds to torture her for information on Luke and the Jedi. Then casually Kylo just cuts Snoke in half and kills him. What the f*** is going on? Okay, so during this section, Snoke shows incredibly strong Force abilities. He's casually throwing Rey around, piercing through her Force barrier, and he's casually saying that he was the one that bridged her and Kylo's mind. Snoke dies because he senses clarity to kill within Kylo, but doesn't realize that the killer intent is for him. How can someone so powerful in the Force just casually die like that? After this, one of the worst fight scenes in Star Wars history happens, as you have to completely throw away your common sense to make Rey and Kylo's victory over the Royal Guards believable. Kylo then reinforces the theme of moving on from the past and extends his hand to Rey because he wants them both to rule the galaxy. Moreover, the conversation of Rey's parents comes up and she finally admits that her parents were nobodies, just drunk traders that sold her off for drinking money. Ren then says that she's a nobody and has no place in this story, but to him she's special. She refuses to join him and they both reach out in the Force for the Skywalker saber, which leads to it breaking. Now there's a lot to unpack here, so I'll start off with Snoke first. Snoke's death in this film was hugely detrimental to this trilogy's story because of how they portrayed him, Kylo and Rey so far. Snoke is clearly very powerful, so for him to die as abruptly as he did honestly lowers the stakes in this film drastically, as it's hard to take any of the villains seriously. Kylo has only won a single fight, and that was against Finn at the end of The Force Awakens. Other than that, he's been portrayed as conflicted and someone who was constantly latching onto the past with Vader's helmet, which is why I actually like the fact that he's trying to move on from the past. However, with Rey as our protagonist, it's hard to comprehend how Kylo could even win against her in a fight, as she is treated like Jesus. Don't get me wrong, she clearly has character struggles which we touched on earlier, but she hasn't actually lost a fight yet, and her temptation to the dark side is clearly not real. It's near the end of the second movie and she hasn't had a true training arc, and you expect me to believe this prodigy who picked up a lightsaber a day ago is going to lose to Kylo, who has done extensive light and dark side training and still can't manage to secure a serious victory. I like the idea of Kylo being the main villain, and I don't think many would be opposed to it if he was actually set up to be an intimidating or formidable villain, but he's not. Even the idea of Rey's parents being nobody is fine, but in the last movie they set it up like she was related to the Skywalkers in some way. A lot of people do believe that Kylo as a Skywalker should be considerably more powerful, which is true, but there's been cases of incredibly strong Force-sensitive users coming from families who are non-Force sensitive, such as Sheev Palpatine. Yeah, I know, many of you just rolled your eyes because we eventually got to talk through that. At minimum, there should have been a power gap leaning in Kylo's favour, but they then reinforced the idea that the light and dark will have equal and opposite forces, which breaks Star Wars again! The idea of the power of the light side and the dark side being concentrated into a number of beings only applies to the dark side. That's why the rule of 2 was a thing, because they allowed the dark side, which is a corrupted section of the Force, to manifest and concentrate into those beings, which made them more powerful. It fits the dark side as the dark side is inherently selfish, whereas the light is selfless. This doesn't apply to the light side, so the idea that the Force would just match a dark side user's power is stupid. Power in the Force is individual, not based on how many light or dark side users or how strong they are, so I hope this idea was just represented in a poor manner and not meant to be an addition to the functionality of the Force. Otherwise, this limits what you can do with the Jedi and Sith going forward, if that's even something that Disney wanted at this point, as they greenlit a project that actively killed off one of their strongest light and dark side users, leaving Rey and Kylo as the only ones left in the power vacuum. Moving on from that, let's go back to the space battle, and Holdo has just light speed jumped into the First Order's capital ship. Yeah, I should have just put a counter of how many times this movie broke Star Wars. In short, that's not how jumping to light speed works. Jumping to light speed takes you to hyperspace, which is an entirely separate dimension, so the Holdo Manoeuvre couldn't have worked. But it does make me question, why didn't they do that for every other space battle? Just throw a couple of droids in capital ships and Holdo Manoeuvre the Death Star. Boom, the heroes win. So all this tells me is that Holdo purposely held back information, which caused Finn and Rose to desperately try and come up with a plan to help the 400 and dropping Resistance members, which then led to a mutiny, the First Order figuring out their plan, and her pulling off a move which, even with the explanation in the next film, they couldn't think of one, still doesn't make sense. Honestly, she becomes a frustrating character when you put everything into context. Overall, when I was watching this film and not thinking too much about it, she was fine. But as soon as you start using some brain cells, you start to get confused as to why the film was painting her out to be a tactical genius. The Resistance makes it to Crait, where they make their stand against the First Order. They send out a distress signal which the entire galaxy does not respond to, and Rose falls in love with Finn. Yeah, Finn's facial expression says it all because they've known each other for less than 18 hours. It's funny. This last half of the film just decided to throw all common sense out of the window. Why isn't the galaxy helping the Resistance out? You know what? They deserve to be ruled under Snoke, because how do you suffer against the Galactic Empire but decide not to do something when someone who has the same MO as Palpatine comes into the picture? The logistics of this whole war makes no sense. People said the prequels were boring, but at least they explained what was going on. Luke appears before Leia and they have a moment which I actually liked, right before he faces off against Kylo. He faces down the First Order and tanks a hail of gunfire, which Kylo shouts more for out of hatred. They 1v1 while the rest of the Resistance escapes, and then we find out he was just projecting himself using the Force from his hermit island. Now that was pretty clever. Luke will surely start heading towards the Resistance. He's dead. He died. The fact that Rian Johnson had the audacity to have him die in front of a twin son boils my blood. As I was saying previously, apparently this ability to project yourself across large distances is an extraordinary feat. It feels anticlimactic, but Snoke and Luke have both used some form of this ability, which, as we now know, can be fatal. I don't like this one bit, nor do I find this earned at all, but I guess his ability follows some sort of logic. The movie basically ends here with the Resistance on the run, ready to rebuild. Honestly, I hate the fact that Luke died at the end because it was anticlimactic, and he literally wasn't able to pass on anything to Rey. That was Yoda's entire lesson. Luke hasn't been given the opportunity to redeem himself, and suddenly he's just dead now. Like, this movie as a whole has so many issues that led to the inevitable rise of Skywalker, because whatever these writers were smoking, I want a hit of that. They broke many universal Star Wars rules, they changed the most popular Star Wars character into an unrecognizable version of himself, especially when people were super happy about his EU portrayal, and they left Star Wars without a future to look forward to. Kylo's too weak, Rey's too strong to the point where people have called her a Mary Sue. Is that my opinion? Well, I've had time to develop my opinion on this, and I'm not going to lie, she is. It does start to feel like a self-insert or created character after a while because she's an incredible pilot, incredibly smart and capable, and she's better than all the Jedi that came before. Even Kylo can't stand up to her, which again makes his whole heel turn feel stupid. They might as well have converted him now and made the last film about them building a new Jedi Order. Now, the difference in opinion that I have is that there is a time and place for powerful characters that seemingly have no flaws, such as Superman, and Rey does have some flaws, such as her attachment issue. I just believe she wasn't written incredibly well to take advantage of those flaws, which might have made her more compelling. Now, most of you guys probably hate this film, but as I said at the start, I think it's a good film. It's just in the wrong franchise. This is the worst Star Wars film, and it's not even close in my opinion. However, if this was a separate sci-fi film, I think it would have been heavily praised. Till this day, the fanbase has been split because of this film. Rian Johnson clearly wanted to leave his mark on Star Wars, and he got his wish, but he ultimately made a finale in the middle of a trilogy, which caused Disney to scramble and get J.J. Abrams back. For those of you that don't remember, he wasn't meant to come back for episode 9, so with that context, I hope you guys can understand why I put more responsibility on Rian Johnson for everything past this point.